they put a gun to the head of police agencies and tell them this is what you're going to do or we're taking you to court. She wrote a piece entitled, "It's Time to Get Rid of Police Dogs." You know what she told me about my dog? She said, "Your dog is racist." And this is the landscape you operate in, and you have to master it as much as you have to master the dog training.
Tell us about that op-ed.
No, it was the Washington Post. It was a op-ed written by a Department of Justice attorney under the Obama administration who was in charge of, we'll say, policing police agencies. The Department of Justice, as I know you know, Garrett, has a program of trying to impose its will on police agencies through what are called consent decrees. The term consent is sort of amusing because there's no consent involved. They put a gun to the head of police agencies and tell them this is what you're going to do, or we're taking you to court and we're going to sue you. And the agencies look at the cost of the litigation and they go, well, you know what, let's just do what they want us to do. So it's a very coercive process. And this particular attorney,
for those folks who don't know, they come into your police department. They assign people to oversee everything you do. They look at all of your records, all of your practices, and provide their suggestions on what you should do going forward or change right now in your training and practices. When it comes to a lot of, we dealt with it with the city of Miami, in and out of consent decrees. And it's frustrating too, because these are not law enforcement professionals guiding you on best practices. These are appointed folks. You can tell us more. You'll get a feel for it now. But they don't have a law enforcement background. They don't know the first thing about policing, but they give their opinion on how things should be done. And so now tell us about this piece that she wrote.
Yeah, so she wrote a piece entitled, "Among Other Police Reforms, It's Time to Get Rid of Police Dogs." And of course that caught my eye and I read it and I shook my head as I read it because there were so many misdirections and false statements and just things that made no sense. So I did write a formal point-by-point response in an article that was published in one of the national canine magazines. But what she was getting at was, really part of this targeting of the canine as something to get rid of. And she had a particular emphasis on the fact that, this is particularly unfair to minorities. And minorities tend to be the primary victims of these physical seizures by dogs.
And by physical seizure, you mean dog bite.
Right. So my response was, well, that would make sense because it would correspond to the percentage of violent crimes and other crimes that lead to the deployment of the canines by people from those communities. Now, we can have the argument about why that happens, and that's a sociological and other argument, but statistically, there's nothing to argue. The fact is that the number of crimes, particularly violent crimes in which dogs may be deployed, are disproportionately committed by people of these communities. That's just the world we live in. So there is nothing surprising that there would be more bites by police dogs of people from these communities if those people are the ones that are disproportionately committing the crime. And I kind of made that point.
And as a police canine handler, it's not like we get to pick and choose which call we're going to respond to. You're called, you have to show up. And can you imagine, and we're probably not too far away from, I think we are there, to be honest with you. Hey, the suspect that ran is a black male. Oh, well, then I can't deploy. What do you mean you can't? Well, I have too many bites. And my last 3 or 4 bites just so happen to be a black and a Hispanic male. I haven't bit a white guy in a year. So I have to keep my ratios right.
It's really unfortunate. I mean, because the implication is that the dogs are trained to bite Black and Hispanic people, and they're not trained to bite white people. And we know that's ridiculous, right? But it's the world we have to exist in. So, the dog is sent to apprehend a bad guy. And if that bad guy happens to be white, then he's the guy who's going to get bit by the dog. And if he happens to be black or Hispanic, then that's who's going to get bit by the dog. It's not determined in advance by what color they are.
Yeah, you've heard the term like a racist dog. It's the
Right.
craziest thing.
One of my students, Greg Kasem, was with Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. This same woman who wrote the op-ed piece was the hit person on the Ferguson Police Department from the Department of Justice.
She got to lead that.
And she went in and Greg told me, it was really funny. He called me one day and he said, John, you know what she told me about my dog? She said, your dog is racist.
Come on.
She told him that. And the funny thing is, his dog was black, which was kind of interesting. But Greg said, oh, really? And he went to his binder that he keeps of all the demos he does in the community. He was very active in the community in Ferguson, and little kids, hugging the dog and riding the dog. And his dog was a very good-natured dog. And, this...
Can you believe that, though?
Yeah.
So this is the woman that is appointed to oversee reform of that police department and thinks that the dog is racist.
Mm-hmm. Well, she's a woman that I said probably never held a dog lead in her hand in her life. Doesn't know, not only to your point, doesn't know about law enforcement, she doesn't know anything about dogs either. So
Your dog is racist.
these are the people put in charge of, hammering these agencies into these consent decrees. And my response to her article was more really because I felt she was misinforming people. And it really, just didn't sit well with me. And I felt that I needed to clarify it. And the public needed to understand too. We talked about this Rayshard Brooks incident earlier. I mean, that was part of what I brought up in that article. What if there had been a police canine available? Do you think those outcomes would have been better than what we were left with as a result of it? Certainly they were better, but she couldn't acknowledge it. Or she wants to get rid of police dogs, which are a less than lethal use of force, but she's not saying anything about police officers carrying deadly force. That makes no sense, right? Like if your big concern is they've got too much force, then you would want to take away their lethal force, not their less than lethal force. So it's very politically driven. And I guess that's another point is kind of overarching everything that relates to canine is that all of our laws come from politics. They just all come from politics. They're not necessarily handed down on stone tablets from, on high. Politicians make the law, and that's just the reality of the society we live in. So when the politics are being driven in a certain direction, then the laws are going to be driven in that direction. And as it affects canine, the laws of what you can and cannot do with that dog will be driven by the political climate.
And the media has a big sway over that.
Oh, yeah, for sure they do.
What they show on the news.
Yes.
How many times they show it, selectively showing the graduation picture, not the picture of the victim throwing up gang signs with guns. They leave that part out of it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Crazy world we live in.
And but this is something that all police officers and certainly canine handlers have to master, and that's what I teach in my class. Don't divorce yourself from this political atmosphere within which all this happens, because you'll be very frustrated. You'll be like, well, why is it coming out like this? Well, there's an explanation. And this is the landscape you operate in, and you have to master it as much as you have to master the dog training.
And I think that's a lot for a young canine handler, even a veteran canine handler, to wrap their head around. We're not interested in politics.
Right.
We're just out there trying to catch a bad guy. We're
Right.
trying to do the best job we can. And it sucks to have to think, well, how will this play out in the 6th district? What judges are sitting there now? No, you can't think about that when you're in a backyard hunting for a murder suspect.
No.
If you're enjoying this podcast, make sure to like, share, subscribe. Check out our second channel, Garret Wing. That's where we post the full interview, unedited, raw, from beginning to end, everything you want to hear and more. We'll see you over there.